It is the summer of 1915 in Blackville, South Carolina, and 3 ministers are standing at the edge of an open grave, their black coats damp with sweat, their Bibles closed in their hands, when the sound rises up from beneath the freshly turned earth. It is not the sound anyone expects to hear from inside a sealed coffin that has just been lowered 6 feet into the ground. It is a voice, a woman's voice, and it belongs to someone the entire town buried only minutes before. The gravediggers freeze with their shovels still in the dirt. A crowd that had come to mourn now stumbles backward in terror, certain they are hearing something that should not exist outside of ghost stories told on a porch after dark. And then, as the coffin lid is wrenched open with trembling hands, the woman inside opens her eyes, looks up at the sky she was never supposed to see again, and smiles. Before we understand how Essie Dunbar came to be lying in that coffin, and before we can make sense of what happened in the seconds after it was pried open, we have to go back to the beginning, to a hot Carolina afternoon when a family gathered around a woman they believed had just died, and a doctor who was absolutely certain he was right. If you're new here, this is the kind of story we dig into on this channel. The strange, half-forgotten corners of history that sound too dramatic to be real, but left behind just enough evidence to make us wonder. Stick around, because before this story is finished, you'll understand not just what happened to Essie Dunbar, but why an entire era of history lived in genuine, bone-deep fear of exactly this moment. Essie Dunbar was 30 years old in 1915, an African-American woman living in Blackville, a small farming town in Barnwell County, South Carolina, the kind of place where cotton fields stretched to the horizon and the rhythms of daily life were dictated by planting and harvest seasons rather than clocks. Very little survives about her early life. She was born around 1885, and for 3 decades, she lived what appears to have been an ordinary existence, embedded in a close-knit family that included a sister living in a neighboring town. It is that ordinary life, and the absence of any reason to expect tragedy, that makes what happened next so unsettling to the people who witnessed it. On that summer day, Essie Dunbar collapsed. She had a history of epileptic seizures, and by every account that survives, this seizure appeared different from the others. She stopped breathing. Her body went still. Her family, frightened and desperate, sent for the only person in town equipped to make sense of what was happening, Dr. D.K. Briggs, the local physician of Blackville. When Briggs arrived, he performed the examination that any doctor of his era would have performed. He checked for a pulse. He listened, or attempted to listen, for breath and heartbeat. He found nothing. By the medical standards of 1915, that was enough. Dr. Briggs pronounced Essie Dunbar dead. To understand why a trained physician could stand over a living woman and declare her gone, we need to understand what death actually meant to medicine in the early 20th century, because it meant something very different than it does to us now that we've moved past this story's own boundaries in time. There was no electrocardiogram to trace the faint, irregular pulse of a heart in crisis. There was no electroencephalogram to detect the flicker of activity in a brain that had not yet shut down. A doctor in Briggs's position had only his hands, his ears, and centuries of inherited medical tradition, much of which was built on assumptions that had never been rigorously tested. Death was diagnosed by absence, the absence of a detectable pulse, the absence of visible breathing, the absence of response to pain or sound. But epilepsy, and the deep comas that sometimes followed severe seizures, could mimic every one of those absences with terrifying precision. A person in a profound post-seizure stupor might have a pulse so faint and shallow, breathing so slow, that it simply could not be detected by a hand pressed to a wrist or an ear pressed to a chest. The heart might be beating 20 times a minute instead of 70. The lungs might be moving only once every 30 seconds. To an examiner with no instruments beyond his own senses, that person looked, felt, and behaved exactly like a corpse. This was not an isolated blind spot in medicine. It was one of the defining anxieties of the era, and it had been building for more than a century by the time Essie Dunbar's family sent for Dr. Briggs. Physicians and lay people alike had documented, in journal after journal and newspaper after newspaper, a long and disturbing catalog of cases in which the dead had turned out, upon exhumation or in the funeral parlor itself, to be very much alive. Some of these cases were later revealed to be exaggerated or invented outright, products of a public imagination, gripped by dread. But enough of them held up to scrutiny that the fear could not be dismissed as pure superstition. Diseases that produced deep, death-like unconsciousness, conditions we would now recognize as catalepsy, severe hypothermia, drug overdose, certain fevers, and post-seizure coma, could all suppress the vital signs to a point where the untrained eye, and sometimes even the trained one, could not distinguish the living from the dead. Because of this fear, an entire culture of precautions had grown up around death and burial by the time of Essie Dunbar's story. Families in earlier decades had been known to press hot irons to the soles of a corpse's feet, hoping for a flinch. They poured warm liquids into the mouths of the newly dead, watching for a swallow reflex. Wealthier households sometimes waited days before burial, allowing decomposition itself to become the only truly unambiguous sign of death. Inventors across Europe and America had patented so-called safety coffins, fitted with bells, flags, breathing tubes, or ladders, all designed to give a prematurely buried person some means of signaling the world above or escaping entirely. Cemeteries in some regions built watchtowers so that guards could listen through the night for any sound rising from the newly filled graves. None of this was theater. It reflected a widespread and reasonable terror, rooted in the genuine limitations of medical science, that a person might be laid into the ground, while still, somewhere beneath the stillness, alive. By 1915, some of that fear had softened in more urban, medically advanced parts of the country, where stethoscopes and more rigorous diagnostic protocols had become standard. But rural communities like Blackville often still relied on a single overworked country doctor, making rapid judgments in a family's front room, under the emotional weight of a grieving household, waiting for an answer. Dr. Briggs was not negligent. He was operating within the accepted medical practice of his time and place, doing exactly what any physician in his position would have done. That is precisely what makes this story so haunting. It was not the failure of one careless man. It was the failure of an entire system of knowledge that had not yet caught up to the complexity of the human body. With Briggs's pronouncement made, the machinery of a Southern funeral in 1915 moved quickly into motion, as it almost always did in that era. There was little of the delay we might associate with modern funeral planning. Embalming was far less universal in rural communities. Refrigeration was unreliable or non-existent, and the Carolina summer heat made speed not just a custom, but a practical necessity. Essie Dunbar's family, however, faced a complication. Her sister lived in a neighboring town and could not arrive in time for an immediate burial. Rather than proceed without her, the family made the decision to delay the funeral until the following morning. scheduling the service for 11 o'clock, giving her sister the night to travel and be present to say goodbye. Try, for a moment, to imagine that night in the Dunbar household. The body of a woman everyone loved, lying still in a modest wooden coffin inside the home, as was the custom of the time, with family members keeping vigil beside her through the darkness, candles or oil lamps casting long shadows against the walls, neighbors arriving with food and quiet condolences, the low murmur of prayer filling rooms that had, only a day earlier, held the ordinary sounds of a woman's living voice. There is no way to know, and no historical record that tells us, whether Essie Dunbar's body showed any small sign that night that might have given someone pause. A flicker of color returning to her skin, a change in her posture, anything that could have been noticed and was not. We can only sit with the unbearable possibility that she may have been present in some diminished way for parts of her own wake. The following morning, the coffin was carried to the church and the funeral began. 3 ministers led the service, which by most accounts stretched on longer than a typical funeral of the time, as if the community itself was reluctant to let the moment end. And still, as the service drew to its close, Essie's sister had not arrived. The family, unable to delay any further, made the decision that thousands of grieving families before them had been forced to make, to proceed with the burial without her. The coffin was carried out to the cemetery, lowered into the grave that had been dug that morning, and covered with the dark Carolina soil, until nothing remained above ground but a fresh mound of earth and the quiet, exhausted grief of the people standing around it. It was only minutes later, according to the accounts that have survived, that Essie's sister finally reached Blackville, her journey delayed by the practical difficulties of rural travel in 1915, when a trip that seems trivial to us now could consume the better part of a day. She arrived to find not a service in progress, but a grave already closed, and the news broke her. She had traveled to say a final farewell to her sister, and had been denied even that small mercy by a matter of minutes. In her grief, she pleaded with the ministers and the gravediggers who remained at the site to open the grave one more time, so that she might look upon her sister's face before leaving. It was an extraordinary request, one that under ordinary circumstances might have been refused outright as impractical, even improper. But grief has its own authority, and after some hesitation, the men agreed. The gravediggers returned to the mound of fresh earth and began to dig it away, shovel by shovel, exposing the wood of the coffin lid beneath. And it was in these final moments, as the lid was pried open and the Carolina daylight fell once more across Essie Dunbar's face, that the story reaches the moment we opened with. According to the accounts passed down through Dr. Briggs's own community, Essie Dunbar was not merely alive. She was conscious, aware, and looking back at the people gathered around her grave with what witnesses described as a smile. The reaction was immediate and, if the surviving descriptions are to be believed, almost as chaotic as the discovery itself. The 3 ministers, men who had just led a solemn funeral service and watched a coffin lowered into the earth, reportedly stumbled backward in shock, so overwhelmed that they fell into the open grave itself, one account claiming that the shortest of the 3 broke several ribs as the others scrambled over him trying to climb free. It is the kind of detail that sounds almost too vivid, almost too theatrical to be real. And that tension between the drama of the story and the historical rigor we owe it is something we need to sit with honestly, because it matters enormously to how this story should be understood. Here is where we have to pause the narrative and be transparent about something crucial. The origins of what we know about Essie Dunbar are far shakier than the vividness of the story suggests. The tale did not enter the historical record in 1915. It surfaced decades later in a 1955 newspaper article published in the Augusta Chronicle, written on the occasion of the death of Dr. Briggs himself, the same physician who had originally pronounced Essie Dunbar dead 40 years earlier. That article did not draw on contemporary 1915 reporting, court records, or medical documentation. It relied on a second-hand account told by a local physician named Dr. O.D. Hammond, who claimed to have treated one of the ministers for injuries sustained during the chaotic exhumation. In other words, the version of events that has been repeated in books, magazine features, and countless retellings since traces back, not to eyewitness testimony recorded at the time, but to a story recounted 40 years after the fact, filtered through at least one intermediary, and then reprinted, essentially unchanged, across newspapers and magazines throughout the following decades. It became further cemented in popular memory when the medical historian John Bondison included it in his widely read 2001 book on the history of premature burial, which drew heavily on that same 1955 article as its primary source. This does not mean the story is fabricated. Essie Dunbar was a real woman who genuinely lived in Blackville, South Carolina, and there is reason to believe something extraordinary did happen to her. Since the core of the tale, an epileptic collapse mistaken for death, does align precisely with the medical realities of the period we've just walked through. But it does mean that historians and fact-checkers examining the story with rigor have to be honest that many of its most cinematic details, the exact words spoken, the precise choreography of the ministers falling into the grave, the smile on Dunbar's face, cannot be verified against any contemporary 1915 source, because no such source has ever been located. What we are left with is something historians encounter constantly when working with oral tradition and delayed reporting. A story that likely has a genuine kernel of documented medical reality at its core, wrapped in decades of retelling that almost certainly added color, drama, and specificity that the original moment may never have possessed in quite that form. What is not in dispute, and what makes this story worth telling regardless of which details are embellished, is what happened to Essie Dunbar afterward, because that part of the record is considerably more solid. She did not die in 1915. She went on living in Blackville for decades more, when she finally passed away in 1962, at roughly 77 years old. Newspapers covering her death made explicit reference to her having survived the doctor who had once pronounced her dead by nearly 4 decades. One report from the period noted, with a kind of dry astonishment, that the very physician who had declared her deceased in 1915 had since died himself, while Essie Dunbar had simply gone on with her life, working her fields, tending to her family, growing old in the same town where she had once been laid into the ground. Whatever precisely happened at that graveside in the summer of 1915, the woman at the center of it lived a long, full life afterward, one that outlasted the very verdict that had nearly ended it decades too soon. If you're finding this as unsettling as I did researching it, go ahead and hit subscribe, because we've got a lot more of these forgotten corners of history waiting to be pulled back into the light. Essie Dunbar's case, whatever its precise contours, sits within a much larger pattern that swept through American and European society across the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, a period sometimes referred to by historians of medicine as an era of genuine, widespread taphophobia, the fear of being buried alive. This was not a fringe anxiety confined to superstitious rural communities. It touched the highest levels of medicine, government, and culture. Physicians published detailed guides on how to distinguish true death from its deceptive imitators. Legislators in several countries debated mandatory waiting periods before burial. Wealthy families paid for elaborate mausoleum systems with bell pulls that a revived occupant could ring to summon help from a watchman stationed nearby. Newspapers across the period regularly ran accounts, some verified, many exaggerated or invented for sensation, of coffins exhumed to reveal scratched lids, disturbed shrouds, and bodies found in positions inconsistent with peaceful death. Evidence, or apparent evidence, of a desperate struggle that had taken place after the earth had already been shoveled over the grave. The reasons for this widespread fear were not irrational. They were rooted in the very real diagnostic limitations we discussed earlier in Essie Dunbar's own examination. Before reliable methods existed for detecting faint cardiac activity, before doctors understood the full range of conditions that could suppress vital signs to the point of apparent death, the line between the living and the dead was drawn almost entirely by trained but fallible human perception. Catalepsy, a condition marked by rigid, unresponsive muscles and a drastically slowed heartbeat, was frequently mistaken for death outright. Deep hypothermia could slow a person's pulse to a crawl. Certain fevers and poisonings produced comas so profound that breathing became nearly undetectable without modern instruments. And as Essie Dunbar's story illustrates, severe epileptic episodes, particularly the deep postictal state that can follow a prolonged seizure, could produce exactly the kind of stillness that a country doctor, working with nothing but his hands and his ears, might reasonably mistake for the final stillness of death. The consequences of this uncertainty rippled outward into the practical culture of death itself. Funeral customs across much of the rural American South in this period emphasized speed, driven largely by the practical realities of heat and the absence of reliable embalming or refrigeration, which paradoxically increased the risk of premature burial, even as it addressed a different and very real problem of decomposition. A body that might, in a cooler climate or with modern preservation technology, have been kept under observation for days, was in the Carolina summer heat, often buried within 24 to 48 hours, precisely the window during which a person in a deep coma might still show signs of reviving, if only there had been time to notice. The very customs designed to handle death with dignity and practicality in a difficult climate also narrowed the margin for catching a mistake. It would be inaccurate to claim that Essie Dunbar's case single-handedly reformed American burial practice, and a documentary owes its audience honesty on this point, rather than manufactured significance. Her story, as it circulated decades after the fact through newspapers, magazines, and eventually Bondison's book, functioned primarily as one particularly vivid entry in a much larger body of premature burial folklore and case history that had already been accumulating for well over a century by the time she supposedly opened her eyes in that Blackville cemetery. The broader wave of medical reform, the development of more rigorous death certification standards, the gradual adoption of embalming as a more universal practice, the introduction of the stethoscope and later more sophisticated diagnostic tools into standard medical examination, and the eventual near-total disappearance of safety coffin patents from the marketplace. All of these developments arose from the accumulated weight of countless documented and undocumented cases across decades and continents, not from any single incident, however dramatic. What Essie Dunbar's story does offer us, whether every detail of its dramatic retelling is precisely accurate or not, is a strikingly human window into why that broader fear existed at all. and why it was never merely superstition dressed up as medicine. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that we cannot fully verify the most cinematic elements of this story, and I don't think that uncertainty makes it less worth telling. It tells us something honest about how history actually survives, not as a clean, fully documented record, but as fragments, second-hand accounts, newspaper clippings written decades after the fact, and the persistent, very human need to make sense of a moment when the boundary between life and death, a boundary we like to imagine as absolute and unmistakable, turned out to be far more fragile than anyone in that Blackville churchyard had ever wanted to believe. Essie Dunbar lived, by every reliable account, for decades after the day she was declared dead and laid into a coffin. Whatever precisely happened at the edge of that grave, however much the decades of retelling may have colored the details, the medical reality underneath her story was real, was documented across an entire era of frightened, careful, occasionally desperate innovation, and still leaves us with an uncomfortable question that no amount of modern retelling can fully resolve. How many others, in towns far smaller and far less remembered than Blackville, never had a sister arrive late enough and loving enough to ask for one more look before it was too late? If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with me while I was piecing it together, let me know in the comments what part of it struck you most, and consider subscribing for the next one, because history has no shortage of moments, this strange, this human, and this easy to forget.